Today I'm going to be going over the finer points of the two major groups of cold chisels that I use. So if you have a question about how to heat treat these chisels or how they're used, stick around. Hi, I'm Dennis Frechette and welcome back. Today I'm going to be explaining the two major groups of cold chisels that I use. One is just called a cold chisel and the other I refer to them as engraving chisels. Cold chisels are used for very rough work. They have a fine edge on them, but they're generally not used as a cutting tool. They're used to create a score line in material or to break off huge pieces of metal. So that's what a cold chisel does. And everything else I call engraving chisels, and they're chisels that are designed to remove a shaving, much like a woodworking chisel does. So they can be just basically a finer form of cold chisel or right down to actual engraving tools that you can use to cut in decorative work on a surface of a piece of metal. So I'm going to explain how I use them and more importantly, how the two of them are heat treated very differently. And I think that's what's confusing a lot of people. They think, okay, it's a cold chisel. There's one temper color for that, but that's not the case at all. And I'll be going over that in this video. So that's what I have for you today, and I hope it helps you out. Here I have an example of the two different cold chisels that I use. At first glance, they might appear to be very similar, but they actually do have very different applications, and as a result, they need to be sharpened differently and they need to be heat treated differently. The chisel on the left is one of my engraving chisels. This is not a hardware store item. They are usually made to do a specific job, so the best approach is to just go ahead and make them. The one on the right is just your standard cold chisel, and it's available in any hardware store today. Cold chisels are usually made out of much heavier stock, and that's because they are normally used with very heavy hammers. The optimum cutting angle for a cold chisel is 60 degrees, and that is made up of two 30-degree single bevels that roughly line up along the center line of the chisel. The most common application for a cold chisel in the blacksmith shop is to cut metal. And to do that, you would place the cold chisel at 90 degrees to the surface, and you would drive the cutting edge directly into the surface with a heavy hammer. I'm not actually cutting away any material here. The chisel is acting as a fuller, and the bevel edge is displacing the material, leaving behind a very sharp V groove. This creates a stress point that'll cause the metal to break along that chisel line. Here I'm demonstrating with a fairly thin piece of sheet metal, but it can also be used on much heavier stock. So the theory is to create this score line, you need to drive the chisel into the surface of the metal to about half the thickness of the material. So with a thin piece of sheet metal, that doesn't take much effort, but as you move into heavier bar stock, the width of that score line becomes wider and wider, so the chisel needs to withstand quite a bit of hammering to get to that depth. Here I have a sample board with the full range of tempering colors. For my cold chisels, I use the colors found on 7, 8, and 9. Sample 7 will give me a really strong cutting edge, but it'll still be flexible enough to take a lot of pounding. If I let the temper colors drift up as high as 9, it'll still be a good cold chisel, but I won't be able to use it as effectively to shave metal because the cutting edge won't be as hard as sample 7. Engraving chisels, on the other hand, are designed to cut away a very specific amount of metal. They're usually sharpened as a single bevel tool, and the bevel angle is much shallower. I use roughly a 45-degree angle. Engraving chisels are only used with very light hammers, so we can sacrifice a lot of the flexibility that we need in a cold chisel in order to put a really hard cutting edge on this tool. The tempering colors that I use on my engraving chisels are seen here as sample 2 and 3. That is, I will temper them as light as number 2, but I will not go above number 3. That leaves me with a very hard cutting edge that holds up very well, but I know that if I start using a slightly heavier hammer to push these chisels, I'm going to start running into problems because the cutting edge is just not flexible enough to absorb the shock from these heavier hammers. So as you can see, you cannot use the same temper for cold chisels and engraving chisels. They are two different tools and they need their own temper to work effectively. If you try to make a compromise and find something that's somewhere in the middle, what you're going to be left with is a cold chisel that's too brittle to take the pounding that a cold chisel has to take, and you're going to have an engraving chisel that's too soft to maintain a good cutting edge. And here's the key bit with